This podcast is meant for general health information and is not meant to override any medical advice. All questions will be screened and not contain any personal information. If you want a private consultation, contact us via positivechoice.org, or you can contact your provider directly. Thank you and enjoy the episode.
Hello, and welcome to the Positive Choice Wellness Podcast. My name is Melanie, and I'm an exercise physiologist.
My name is Kimberly, and I'm a registered dietitian.
My name is Brandon, and I'm a kinesiologist.
Yay! Simple title today. Woo! We're all like patiently waiting at what are you going to say?
Yeah.
What is it today?
This is our new tradition.
Which I appreciate. It's kind of fun. It's kind of like just roll the dice. What's it today, Brandon? I don't know.
Well, you two
Agreed.
need to come up with some other hats. You wear many hats as well. Embrace them. Melanie, you're a personal trainer. You're a website designer. Kimberly,
oh, yeah. I'll just say I'm a
personal
website designer and people will want to sign up and work out with me. That's really convincing, Brandon.
Hilarious.
She's got an attention to detail. She won't let any form slip.
Yeah, I wear many things. I wear many hats. I do many things. But at the end of the day, I'm still an exercise physiologist by degree, and a kinesiologist technically, if you count my bachelor's. But we're not talking about exercise today.
No.
It's been a minute, but we're not. And we're actually going
Yes.
to talk about nutrition. Kimberly.
Yay! So fun.
I know it's your wheelhouse now.
Heck yes.
So Brandon's just been a wealth of just ideas for what we can talk about for this podcast. And he came up with a really interesting idea to talk about the difference between low carb and low fat diets, which, still are around, believe it or not, still a thing. And I'm just curious as to what brought upon this research that you started doing into these things.
Yeah, Melanie, that's a good question. I don't just come up with these topics because I think they're cool. I come up with these topics. Actually, the patients, they come up with these topics for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So this came up because I would have a lot of patients ask me, hey, my friend is doing a low carb diet. They lost all this weight. What do you think? Or another one would be like, hey, my friend's doing this low fat diet. What's the difference between the two? Which one should I do? And I was like, well, I'm a personal trainer. That's not really my background, but I want to find out. So I did some research on my own. And that's what led us to this topic today.
All right.
Love
Well,
it.
I'm excited to talk about it. I was sharing before we started that as a younger individual, when I was in my early teens, I was a participant of many of these types of diets because of my mom. So I am very familiar with them. So I think while I'm not a dietitian, I can at least contribute to the experience. But I think I guess a good place to kind of take it is, do you want to define like the difference between these diets? I think it comes with the title with the low carb versus low fat, but like, what does that really mean?
Yeah. Well, I also want to think about like the why behind this question in the first place. Like, why are
Yeah.
our patients asking us these questions? Like, what do you think, Kimberly?
It's a good question. I think there's a couple answers to that, but one would be they want like a defined solution. Like this
Of
is going to
course.
be the thing that works, right? Like
Mhm.
this is the formula. I just got to follow it type of thing. So they want that, but also things are trendy, right? And now we have like social media and the internet. So things are really trendy and popular, and you see what works for some people. Even if we don't follow every moment of their lives, we think that what they're saying is true and that's working, and whatever. So yeah, I think that's a little bit where it comes from my experience anyway.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So that's what, when it comes to low carb especially, I feel like those ones in particular have been very trendy as of late. I think low fat was like, I still think it's a thing, but it was more popular. Remember when fat was made the enemy? Was that like the 90s? Fat
Yeah.
was like
I
awful.
grew up in that era.
Yes, exactly. Right. Like
Fat
fat
was
was the
bad.
worst thing ever. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And kind of gets a negative connotation just because of the name. Right. But
Mhm.
anyway.
It's interesting
Yeah.
too, I think, because of it's shifted in terms of the type of diet, because before low
Mhm.
fat was just like the long story short is the sugar industry paid off a bunch of researchers to lie about data to convince the population that fat was bad for us and therefore we should not eat fat. That's why we had low fat diets in the 90s. It was all fraud. So
Mhm.
yeah, there's like documentaries on this stuff. It's wild. So like
Mhm.
knowing that little bit of information, it was just the general populace is like fat's just bad. So it wasn't necessarily a low fat diet per se, as it was just villainized as a macronutrient.
Fair enough.
Whereas
Yeah.
now there's a lot of research coming around with like reversing heart disease and things that can affect your heart. And so low fat diets are now back in trend, but I think less of a schadenfreude and more of like, there's actually some research sort of backing a little bit of it. So, which I'm not super privy to, but I'm curious about if you happen to know any. But that's my knowledge of this, at least in terms of low fat and how it shifted over our years, the culture and stuff like that.
Yes. I agree with that. And I think it's also, I almost think of it as less, I don't know if this is going to make any sense. I almost don't think of it as low fat, but the other foods you're emphasizing, right? So when you go
Mhm.
more plant-based, for example, naturally your diet is going to be lower in fat than someone who's eating more animal products. So I almost think of it as more what you're emphasizing as opposed to cutting out, I guess.
Yeah.
If that, I don't know. But anyways,
No, that makes sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of diets out there, and it seems like most of them can be put into the category of low fat versus low carb. Like there's some like protein, animal meat only diets, and there's like different fasting patterns that you can follow. But in the scope of this conversation today, most of the like all the research that I looked at was just in the context of one, weight loss, two, diabetes, and three, other metabolic parameters like blood pressure, blood glucose, and things like that. So I
Mhm.
didn't like I couldn't do a deep dive into very specific diseases
Mhm.
and disease reversals like this. So I think the context of this conversation and the research I found is a lot more just general for just people who may want to lose weight and maybe who are pre-diabetic or want to just not be diabetic anymore.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So I think that's an important disclaimer here is we're not like saying this stuff we're going to share is not like for everybody
Yeah.
potentially. Like you still got to like consider your own unique situation.
Yeah.
I mean, I get an abundance of patients who want to talk about like doing a low carb diet specifically for type 2 diabetes or like pre-diabetes and stuff like that. So it's a very common question that I've been getting to is like, I need to eat low carb. And then like, this is my favorite part is even when they say, oh, I don't eat carbs anymore. And I just had a salad. I'm like, what was that a carb?
Yeah. Do you know what
'Cause
vegetables are?
vegetables
just-
are a carb. But I think when people say low carb, I think they're really talking more about like starchy vegetables, so like your potatoes, your corn, that kind of stuff, breads, pastas, those types of things,
Rice,
low
yeah.
carb. They're not talking about necessarily fruit or vegetables. So I think to specify the type of quote unquote low carb diet we're referring to here would be more of a less processed carbohydrate, less refined carbohydrate type diet, more natural, unprocessed foods,
Yeah. I would agree
give
with
or
that.
take.
Mhm.
So as far as like, because obviously in the context of what is being sought after with these types of diets, I guess considering like Positive Choice is known as like a, health and wellness clinic specifically geared towards weight loss, I guess we could start there because I think that's a good place. If people are seeking weight loss, you want a one size fits all plan, but yet there's a million different plans out there, like what do you pick? And so we end up being pared down to like low carb or low fat, I feel like almost more often than not. Like,
Mhm.
what are our thoughts on that? What is there a better one? Is there something else we want to look into instead? Like, what do we do?
Yeah, well, let's dive into this first randomized control trial on low
Okay.
carb versus low fat. This is from the Journal of American Medicine, and it's from 2018. And so they had 609 adults aged 18 to 50 years old without diabetes, but they had a BMI of 28 to 40.
Okay.
And they randomized those people into two groups: a a healthy low fat diet and a healthy low carb diet. And they followed them for 12 months. And at the end of the 12 months, they looked at the weight change. And what they found is that the healthy low fat diet lost 5.3 kilograms, and the healthy low carb diet lost 6 kilograms. And so statistically, that is not a significant difference between both of
Mm-mm.
those diets. So
Yeah.
this study found that for those without diabetes, their weight loss outcomes were essentially the same between a healthy low fat and a healthy low carb diet.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to do the math here. So 5.3, you said 5.3, right? Kilograms?
Yeah.
That's roughly a little over 11.5 pounds. Okay.
Mhm.
And then you said 6, which is 13. So there's
Yeah.
a pound and a half
pound and
difference
a
between the
half.
groups. So we can make that with our American math. So, okay.
Easy.
So insignificant. There's barely any change between the two groups.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So it's
And
really
that's
kind of summarizing that, like, well, that's one study, but that so far doesn't seem to make a difference.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Were they controlling for how many calories they were eating too, or was this strictly this low fat, low carb, not controlling for amount of calories per day?
That's a really good question, and I don't know off the top of my head.
Why? How dare you? You should know this,
Let
Brandon.
me look. Let me look.
Let me see.
Yeah, and that's a good learning lesson too, is like there's so many things, like we could probably spend the whole hour dissecting this one
Oh
study.
yeah.
And so there's things that we're inherently going to overlook in sharing this. So just always take everything for a grain of salt, right?
hmm I mean,
Mhm.
what I love about research is it just gives us data, and we can use that with what we want to, and we can compile that and have a general opinion about something based on all the information we're getting. But there's so many factors that can play in. So we as people who are in the research field, we can't believe everything 100% because there's studies that come out that say the exact opposite of what we're finding right now. So it is a complex thing to dive
Yeah.
into. So I would agree. We won't do that today.
No.
Yeah.
Nutrition is a living, breathing organism, I tell you. Always
Yeah.
changing.
Okay. So
So
then did they do go ahead, Brendan.
yeah, so the next study, if we just kind of want to go through study on this low carb versus low fat, there's one other maybe we could talk about.
Yeah.
And this was not just one single study, but this was a systematic review of multiple studies from 2022 from the Journal of Nutrients.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so what they did is they compared both of those diets in diabetics. So the
Mm.
last one was not, but this one was for diabetics. So we're going to get some specific data on HbA1c levels. And what they found was that except for reducing HbA1c levels in the short term, the
Mhm.
low carb diet appeared to be equally effective as the low fat diet. So what they're saying is like low carb might be a viable like short to intermediate term diet for those with diabetes. If
Mhm.
they're like if most of their carbs they're eating are like low quality carbs, like a lot of refined processed carbs, they could
Mhm.
Yeah.
probably benefit a little bit more with a low
Mhm.
carb diet. But if someone is already kind of have eating healthy carbs or at least just decent amount of carbs, it doesn't really matter according
Okay.
to this review between low
Okay.
carb and low fat.
Interesting. Interesting.
Mhm.
I know some people who will be very unhappy to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah. True.
Okay. Well, that's
Why
that's an
would they
interesting takeaway.
why would they be unhappy to hear that?
Well, I find that, and this is just a generalization, but I find that the majority of the people who have come to me about wanting to do low carb are very strongly holding their beliefs that low carb is what's helping them.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So I feel like it's disrupting people's worldview, if
Yeah, some
anything.
cognitive dissonance, right?
Little bit.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, I'm
I
sure you've had
agree.
experiences similarly, Kimberly.
Yes, it's like there's a vendetta out against carbohydrates. And I don't know if
Mhm.
it's because carbs are very easy to love, right? And they're very
Oh yeah.
easy to overindulge in. And obviously, the day and age that we live in, it's very easy to get in too much of the low quality kinds that we don't want to have, but or we don't want to have as much of. But yeah, there's absolutely like people think that cutting them out, that is the answer. And I think that when people cut them out, they're so passionate about it because sometimes you do see results really quick, right? Like carbs and water are found together. So when you stop eating carbs, you do lose some water weight, you lose some, bloat and things like that. But I think people are passionate about it because they see results or have seen other people see results, or maybe they're doing it and it's actually really stinking hard. Like it's very hard to go low carb because your
Mhm.
body wants them. It's our body's primary fuel source, right? So they want to know that the difficult thing they're struggling through, like, is the answer. I don't
It's
know.
worth it. It's worth the struggle.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Which
Yeah.
I've done low carb like long ago. Not worth the struggle.
Okay.
So it's not worth the struggle. Not well, I was playing
Oh.
water polo at the time. Not a smart idea.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
Knowing what I know now, I can't believe
Melanie.
I did that. I know because I had no energy at all.
No, you wouldn't. You just straight up wouldn't. Wow.
hmm
Difficult. Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
So
so
that should be good news, right? Anyways, go
Yeah.
ahead.
well, I want to like I thought of some like questions that came out of that. Like, so people hold on to their like ideas really strongly of like
Hmm.
their specific diets, and part of what a diet does is it removes something, right? In this case, we're talking
Mhm.
about low carb, it removes carbs, but like what else do diets do?
They restrict you.
Yeah. It's all
Okay.
the no's,
They
right? Can't
well,
have
they restrict
this.
you. They restrict you in a way I think that makes it like parameters. Like here's what you do. Like follow this recipe. And
Mhm.
my understanding from working at Positive Choice for as long as I have is that people really like that. People really like just tell me what to do and I'll do
Mhm.
it. And with low carb diets, considering like I would say 70% of the food we eat is carbs, um, or has carbs at least, like that would probably be something where they have parameters. Now they know what to rule out and they can stick with the exact things they know they can have. And I think that's a big part of it. Is just it's easier to follow, I guess is the best way to put it.
I agree. I think they want the structure. And then I also think there's something to be said for the word diet triggering something like temporary in our mind. Like if I
Mhm.
just do this for X amount of time, I'll reach my goal and then I can go back to what I was doing before.
Mhm.
That's a big thing we talk about at Positive Choices lifestyle, right? Versus diet.
Mhm.
But anyway,
Balance.
yes,
I think that's why
balance.
sometimes it might be helpful to frame to our patients like a dietary pattern that kind of gives
Mm,
it more of a permanent
Mhm.
kind of
love that.
sound than a diet, right?
Yeah.
I
But
mean, when we say low carb, the first thing I'm going to say is diet. That's
Yeah.
the
yeah.
first thing I say because diets are restrictive. That comes with the territory. So
Yes.
if you're having an eating plan, I'm doing air quotes you can't see, but if you're doing an eating plan and it tells you not to eat a bunch of things, that is a diet.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, nothing sustainable for life
Mhm.
Mhm.
is gonna
But
be that restrictive, right?
Yeah.
I think some other reasons, including what you mentioned about why diets work, is because they also increase people's awareness of their eating decisions while they're in that temporary
Mhm.
state of dieting. And
Oh
so
yeah.
that's really
Mm.
powerful. Just to have more awareness of what you're eating. And every single diet, if you type in like the respective diet and then healthy plate or like model
Mhm.
um, of the meal, they all include eating more fruits and vegetables, or they all have an emphasis of adequate or consistent protein, and they have some type of component of reducing less healthy foods like
Mhm.
refined and ultra processed. So I think sometimes people they chalk all the results up to like the thing that they took out, but also there's probably a lot of these other things that we're mentioning right now that are part of the power of a
Mhm.
diet.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm of the mindset that if it works for you, it works. Like if it works, it works. And that's
Yeah.
everyone's different. Like we're not one person is like another, not even identical twins. Like everyone's different. And so
Mhm.
what your body needs will vary wildly from someone else. And that's, I mean, that's honestly why it's so hard for people to, they struggle with losing weight for that exact reason, because we're all so wildly different from one another.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've met people who have done, low carb diets and been very successful, but then I've also met people who've done low carb diets who are not successful at all. So I don't think it's a one size fits all approach. I think people just want to try something to see if it'll work. And I'm not opposed to that. I do have something being a product of diet culture. I do have some qualms with that, but maybe personal vendetta. I don't know.
Understandable though. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with what you said.
Yeah, that's a good takeaway for this whole
Mm.
topic. According to the research, it looks like for most people, either one works for you.
Hmm.
So pick the one that works best for you with the food that's accessible, with the recipes that you enjoy cooking, and go with that.
I mean, if that's
Love that.
if you're seeking to do something of that sort, I guess would be the premise of this conversation
Hmm.
too, because like the approach through positive choice, and we still stand by it as a well-balanced, healthy diet as a result of like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, healthy fats. Like we want you to have it all. We don't like to do restriction within our own guidelines, but if this is something you're curious about, like this is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the part that's hard about nutrition, I feel like, to your point, Melanie, is there's sometimes on an individual level, there's some trial and error involved, right? Like you like try this and my body didn't respond. So I'm going to try that and maybe it will. But I think it's also important to note whether you are trying something like this or otherwise that like, I feel like I'm spoiling the ending here, but it's really, really important to consider the quality of the foods that you are choosing. Okay. If you're
Mhm.
going to go, low fat and decide to like really ramp up your carbohydrates, it is not going to help you at all to eat like bags of chips and, like the ultra processed type of carbohydrates
Bread.
that are, yes, right.
Bread.
White bread, all that stuff. Versus if you do go low carb, naturally you're going to have a higher fat diet. It's not going to help you at all to be eating tubs of butter and things of, coconut oil. So, you do have to consider like the sources of your food as well, the quality
agree.
of them.
I agree.
So Kimberly, kind of what you're saying is our focus should not be primarily on the quantity of a carb or quantity of a fat, but more of the quality of it.
1,000,000%. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm a huge proponent of just a
quality.
quality diet, period. All
Yeah.
aspects should be quality food. I
Yeah.
was talking earlier about how I hate trans fats. That's not a quality food. So, that kind of stuff.
Yes,
Yeah.
100%. And to the point of trans fats too, and quality food, you want your food to have less of a hand on it or manipulation to it by the time it gets to you, right? Like
Mhm.
ideally our ingredients lists don't take up half of the box. Like we want them to be shorter, right? Or get the foods that don't even come with ingredients lists to begin with. So things like that. We want good quality, less manipulation when it comes
Mhm.
to those foods.
I
Okay.
agree.
Yeah, I want to pivot back to another cool study. I mean,
Yeah.
we could honestly wrap it up right there. Boom, that's it.
All
That
right,
was a really
folks.
good ending. So we could decide to end it there. But if we want to throw this in here too, I looked at this study and it was they collected dietary intakes of adults with and without diabetes for 3 years. And so they use dietary recall so that people would like have to remember and write down what they ate. So there's like some issues with that, of course. But what they found is that the percentage of carbs between those with and without diabetes was similar. So it's
Hmm.
like, oh wow, I think in a lot of people's heads we have this idea that people who get diabetes, they get there because they have too many carbs. They're eating a lot of carbs. But according to this study that looked at 3 years of dietary intake, both those with and without diabetes ate a similar amount of carbs. So that kind of reinforces again this idea about quality is more
Mhm.
important than quantity.
And
Love
also
that.
to add that it's not just too many carbs that leads to diabetes. It's another factor for a lot of other things too, especially if you're like overweight, like severely overweight, that it's just a risk factor in general for being overweight, regardless of how many carbs you're eating.
Right. Right. And I would also just to tag on to that for anybody who's looking to get their blood sugars under control or whatever, just optimize that or even just stay fuller for longer. While carbs there are certain ones that are absolutely great for us, right? Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, all that good stuff. Always pair your carbs with a good healthy protein or a good healthy fat.
Mhm.
That will help, release it into your system slower so you don't have the blood sugar spikes that we can even get sometimes with the healthy ones. So just
Yep.
always make those pairings like an apple and peanut butter, something like that instead of eating the carbs totally alone.
Love that. Pair your
Cool.
macros, friends. Pair
Pair
'em.
them up. You'll be grateful.
Mhm. But it's just interesting to see that it really does matter with, quality, and then on top of that just knowing that the difference really wasn't that significant between the two groups, which I find interesting. Um I guess partly because I look at it and I know that from an exercise perspective at least, carbs are kind of crucial for having energy to exercise for a majority of the types of activities that we do. So as human
Yeah.
beings, at least half of our diet needs to come from carbs in general just to function properly,
Yeah.
and especially if you're active. But it's just if when people say they're low carb, it seems like they're just finding other ways to eat carbs, is what I'm hearing.
I would agree with that. Yeah, maybe ways that like foods that they don't really count as a carb, right? Because it's
Mhm.
not like an in your face piece of bread,
Yeah.
That's a good point.
So I'm wondering if they don't think vegetables and fruits are carbs or beans aren't carbs because they're considered healthy, so therefore they can't be like a carb. Because again, like the classification of a carb right now is basically junk, or
Yeah.
breads or pastas or things like that. So I would be willing to bet it's just a misconception of what a carb is. You know?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And there's a lot of, I think exactly to your point, that's why carbs get a bad reputation to begin with, is because of what we do. Like, that's why potatoes have a bad rep, right? We usually eat them as chips or deep fried as potato, whatever. What are those
Mhm.
called? French fries. Jeez.
French fries,
But
that one.
those things.
Okay, I
But,
got a
but anyway, yeah.
I have a controversial question. Speaking of potatoes, are sweet potatoes healthier than regular potatoes?
That is a good question. That I feel like research factually, I cannot say that this is something I have found in research. So I haven't actually looked it up. But what I usually tell patients, because I was actually just asked this the other week, is that the color that comes with sweet potato definitely has more like antioxidants present, right? Which are disease fighting and super good for us. Sometimes people don't eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. Their diets are a little lacking in the antioxidant department. So from that perspective, sweet potato is fabulous. I also do believe they're a little bit higher in fiber, but as long as you eat the skin with said potatoes. But there's nothing wrong with the good old white potato either, as long as
Mhm.
you eat it as
A
healthfully as
potato.
possible, not as not as a French fry or
I tell
smothered in
people,
butter. But
I tell people,
yeah,
potatoes are not the villain here. It's how we
they're
prepare them.
not.
That's the
It's
problem.
so true. It is so
Mhm.
Mm.
true. Swap out that sour cream for some Greek yogurt. I feel like they taste kind of the same, right? So yeah, there's
Mhm.
nothing wrong with the good old potato. Eat them all. Eat both.
Mhm.
Okay, that makes sense.
Good
Mm.
news for everybody. Potatoes
I
are
know.
fine.
I feel like this podcast overall should be good news because carbs are not the enemy. It's
Oh,
just about picking quality ones, right? Ideally, more single ingredient ones that you can get, the better.
yeah.
And I would also add, from my experience, there is benefit to the way you structure your carbohydrate eating during the day. Because, like Melanie mentioned, from the exercise perspective, they are our primary fuel source. It is best to get our carbohydrates in at like the beginning chunk of our day, right? Breakfast, lunch, snack, versus at dinner.
Mhm.
Typically at dinner, we're winding down and going to bed. So we don't need the traditional dinner of like pasta and breadsticks, right? So trying to
Oh.
emphasize carbs, I know, want want more at the beginning chunk of our day versus the end, can be
Okay.
helpful as far as like weight loss, weight management, all that stuff.
Yeah. Now I have a question, which is going to shift gears a little bit, just because we're talking about quality,
Mhm.
and I don't think we can talk about fat structuring throughout the day because that's not as relevant as carbs. But
True.
quality of fat, because we're talking about quality of carbs. What about fat?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked because we're both passionate about this one.
Yes.
But fats super like equally as important to pay attention to the quality as your carbohydrates, right? Because there's a lot of less healthy fats out there that are very easy for us to consume in a plethora as well. So super important to emphasize what we would call the good heart healthy fats, right?
Hmm.
Olive oil, avocado oil, nuts, seeds, nut butters, those kinds of things. Again, one or two ingredients in your nut or seed butters, nothing else. But versus, trans fats, like we talked on earlier a little bit,
Get me
saturated
on my
fats.
soapbox. I'll just be like,
Yeah,
trans fats.
trans fats. Tell us
Hydrogenated
about
oil's the
them.
enemy. No, I
Yes.
mean, I don't want to get into too much of it because I could talk about this for an hour. But
Fair.
just to summarize very briefly, for trans fats, those are what we call hydrogenated oils. They are, for the most part, man-made. I would say 90%, 99% of them are man-made. Very, very seldom
Mhm.
do they occur naturally,
Mhm.
because they essentially transform a liquid fat to behave like a solid fat through a process called hydrogenation. And the difference between a trans fat and an unsaturated fat is there's a bunch more hydrogens present that were not originally there, hence the term hydrogenation. And your body goes, I don't know what that is. And then it immediately starts storing them in your arteries. So that's why I have like a big like PSA on like don't eat trans fats, because they do us no good. None whatsoever. And in
Oh,
fact, they raise your cholesterol, the bad one, the LDL. So they lower your good cholesterol too. They lower your good cholesterol, raise your bad cholesterol, and they stick to your arteries and cause blockages over time. So just don't.
yeah.
Because
Lots
I
of negatives.
that's the only thing I say. Don't do
Just
it.
don't. Yeah. And to Melanie's point, I would never ever trust the number on the nutrition fact label. So
No.
trans fats required to be there. You'll always see it. Probably 9.5 times out of 10, you're going to see a 0 there. Super ignore it because there's some funkiness with the law there where they can put a 0, even if there's some trans fats in there.
Under
So
half a gram.
always look at the ingredients list and look for hydrogenated oil or partially hydrogenated oil
Or
and
shortening.
or shortening.
Yep.
Absolutely. And that's your key. Those are red flag terms. That product contains trans fats, regardless of what that number says.
Hmm. I'm
Yeah.
done with my PSA now, Brandon. We can continue.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I'm a numbers guy. I want to go over some numbers with everyone
Yeah.
about like
Let's do it.
recommendations for these healthy fats that we've been talking about. So these recommendations, it's coming from a systematic review and from 2021 from the Annals of Nutrition and Metabolism. And what they did is they looked at tons of studies to try to come up with like a, a recommendation for how much saturated fat, how much trans fat, and all that stuff. And so what they said is that, well, we haven't mentioned saturated fat, but they said for the general population, less than 10% of total daily calories should come from saturated fat. So that would be 22 grams for a 2,000 calorie diet. However, they said that for populations with dyslipidemia or atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, it should be like half of the amount. So like
Mhm.
5%
Mm-hmm.
of
Makes
calories.
sense.
Yeah. And when it comes to overall fat take, they recommend 30 to 35% of the calories should come from fats. And so that would be like focusing on those MUFAs and those PUFAs,
Hmm.
monounsaturated fatty acids at 10 to 25%, and then polyunsaturated for 5 to 11%. And zero, they said 0%. Well, they technically said 0 to 2% for trans fats,
No,
but we're gonna
I'm ignoring that. Yeah.
we're gonna intervene here and
Agreed.
say zero,
Yep.
0%.
Zero.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and they really emphasized it's all about the quality here.
Mhm.
Focus on that quality.
That's where I would agree very fully with that, and I'm sure Kimberly can go on just as much of a spiel about this as I will. But like because I teach a lot of plant-based classes. I teach a lot of cooking classes that are plant-based. Like I talk a lot about plant-based. For the record, I am not plant-based, but I know a lot about it.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I talk a lot about is limiting saturated fat, which the primary source is animal products. And so when I have these conversations about limiting saturated fat, I feel like people think I'm like on this vegan like thing. I'm like, be vegan. And it's like, no, 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 no. You
Mhm.
just like if you're eating chicken, you don't need to slather butter all over it because the chicken has enough fat. Like you're fine. In fact, most
Yes.
people, if we don't add like butter or cream or those types of things to our foods and just eat lean proteins, we'll get enough saturated fat through our diet without adding
Without
anything extra.
trying. Yeah, I agree with that. And same with like, you don't need to eat the chicken skin, right?
Yeah.
Like things like that. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Just to make people more sad. This is my favorite thing. This is my favorite talk. Is like, here, I'm gonna burst your bubble real far.
Yeah.
Uh,
No.
but yeah, like saturated fats are essential, and I loved it. I love talking about like phospholipid bilayers. But if anyone doesn't know, go back to biology for a hot second back in high school, maybe.
Yeah.
And if you were one of those people who took chemistry, I'm sorry, but I didn't. I took both. I took biology and chemistry, but the phospholipid bilayer is basically membranes around every cell in our body for the most part. And
Mhm.
that's giving them structural integrity. And when we don't eat enough saturated fat, it actually compromises our structural integrity. So we do need some. We
Mhm.
have to have some. But the problem is, especially with the Americanized diet, is we eat a lot of it. We eat too much in this
Yeah.
country.
A lot without really even trying that hard. So
Nope. Not even
yeah.
a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Something that we have to do the opposite and have a little bit less.
Mhm. So if you're going to do low fat, do low saturated fat.
Yeah. And zero trans fat, right?
Yes.
Absolutely.
But I do appreciate that it really comes down to quality, not quantity. I just said quantity. Ha. Freudian slip. So quality. But it comes down to quality,
Yes.
right? Like it turns out we are what we eat.
That's so, yeah, if you had to summarize, that's it. That's totally it. And yeah, you want more foods that don't even come with ingredients lists. And if they do, hopefully it's minimal and you know what all those things are.
Mhm.
There should be less manipulation in our food by the time it gets to us, just to optimize overall health in general for anybody.
Now, I'm going to turn into Brandon for a minute. I'm going to ask you a question, Kimberly. And I don't know if Brandon knows the answer either, but we'll ask it. So, a lot of rumblings are coming around to seed oils. I'm sure you've heard a little bit of rumblings about seed oils. And, I don't know if you have, Brandon, but like there's
Yeah.
been some talk about seed oils being very inflammatory. And I want to hear your thoughts on that, Kimberly.
Okay, happy to. And then I'm interested to hear if Brandon has any like research backup on this. Okay. seed oils are in everything processed virtually, everything processed or convenient, right? So if you're eating anything processed in the grocery store, or you're eating out in any capacity at a restaurant or dining the fast food joint, right? Something like that, you're getting them in. So currently we're eating more than we ever really have because of how much processed stuff we got out there. And while I don't think they were inherently bad, I don't also think that they were meant to be consumed at this copious amount that we eat them. So they are a form of omega-6, which is actually something that we need to consume in our diet. But again, like with saturated fat, the thought here is that we're getting way too much. So
Yeah.
in a perfect world, I would, yes, advise people to have a little bit less. But again, I preach that message anyway, because I want you to have less manipulated processed food to begin with. And another way to kind of counter how much omega-6s you're having, because if you have too much, it promotes inflammation in your system, would be to have more omega-3s. So omega-3s are a healthy source of fat for us, often found in fatty fish. That's probably the source that's most well known for it, but other sources as well, like chia seed and flaxseed and walnuts and stuff. But so yeah, upping your omega-3 content can help, counter having too many omega-6s. But I'm curious to know what you think, Brandon, as well.
Yeah, so seed oil, there's like so many seeds.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, what kind of seeds are we talking about here?
I mean, fun fact, canola oil is a seed oil.
Yeah,
If you didn't know that.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
like 7 main ones that are used in processing. And yeah, canola oil is obviously a huge one.
Mhm.
Okay, so this might cause some cognitive dissonance in people who hate seed oils and therefore they have olive oil. Well, guess what? The seeds in the olives are kept in the olives when they press them. They're called a pit,
Hmm.
but it's still the seed. So when you have olive oil, some of that oil, a little bit of that oil is coming out of that seed. Most of it comes from the fruit, but olive oil still has a little bit of seed oil in there.
Mhm.
So I'm just kind of poking at the bear, just kind of doing a little teasing right now. But it depends on, like, I think what type of seeds we're talking about. Like, I just read a study from the last year about moringa seed oil. So moringa is a type of tree. It's called like the miracle tree because every part of it is edible. It's got all the nutrients that you need to survive, basically. And I actually grew on once. And they found that moringa seed oil reduces cardiovascular disease and all these other things. So it's like, I think we just need to make sure we don't fall in the trap of like overgeneralizing, and
Mhm.
we need to be specific about what type of seeds. Are we talking about canola seed, which is also like, it's technically called
Rapeseed.
rapeseed oil, which is a
Yep.
weird name.
Well, I
But
can tell you the history of why it's called canola oil.
they changed it to sound nicer, right?
Yeah, it's also made in Canada, hence the can for canola, low oleic acid. Canola, low oleic acid Canada oil.
Oh,
That's what it is.
and it still has a lot of omegas in it, right?
It's reduced on the 6s, I think, but I don't think it has a lot of 3s, as far as
It
I
does
know.
not have a great it has some, but it does not have like an amazing proportion of 3s. So I think the culprits, like when we talk about seed oils, especially here in the United States, it is like canola oil, but also soybean oil.
Mhm.
Moringa is not ever one that I've heard thrown around, but I've heard wonderful things about moringa. Don't get me wrong.
It's not
But
something
like
you just go to the store and go, I'm gonna add moringa oil today.
right. Yeah. Let me throw that in the
Flaxseed
cart.
oil, sesame oil.
I mean,
Sesame would be one. Yeah.
The thing to
but-
think about too, though, I mean, a lot of these seed oils are not things that we would generally cook with, I think, outside of canola oil. A lot of them are low heat oils. So they're just added to like products after the fact when they don't need to be heated up anymore a lot of the time.
That's so interesting. Yeah. But if you like, again, it comes down to wanting to eat less processed foods to begin
Yeah.
with, and if you're like reading ingredients lists in the store, a lot of these oils are like the second or third ingredient in there sometimes. So I think that's why they're on people's radars so much right now. But it comes down to quality, right? We want to have less of the manipulated foods anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So
Seems a good way to summarize that, because I figured someone would probably have that question anyways, because we're talking about quality of fats. And like, well, what about seed oils? And it's like, yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah.
I had this conversation in one of my classes the other day about someone was asking about like seltzer being bad for you. And I was just like, no, if it was,
Yeah.
I would die. Like I drink way too much seltzer. So
Oh yeah, that's true.
the
You do.
consensus, I do. I actually don't have one right now, weirdly enough, but I had one earlier. So the consensus that we came to is like everything in moderation and choose
Yes.
quality. Like that was the
Mhm.
general theme of what I was trying to say was like, if you have a ton of seltzer, of course that could be bad for you because a ton of water could be bad for you. A ton of chia seeds could be bad for you. It doesn't matter what it is. If there's a lot of it, it's going to be bad. So we
Yes.
have to have
Makes the
everything in
poison.
moderation. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's a
Yeah.
beautiful way to summarize. Yes.
I actually
Mhm.
bought grapeseed. I've been buying grapeseed oil lately because the olive oil prices have just gotten ridiculous, and we
So
don't. We only
expensive.
cook with oil like a few meals a night, and we'll just do like a tablespoon or something to cook
Mhm.
the meal in. So it's like even if it's not the best, it's like well, it's just like a few tablespoons dispersed throughout the whole dish.
Mhm.
So I'm probably okay with that.
Yeah,
And
a million percent.
and to piggyback off what Kimberly said, is like if you're eating quality, it means you're probably not going out to eat as much. So when you do have it, it's not like it's the worst thing in the world because
Yes.
you're not having a lot of it. If you go out to eat constantly or eat a lot of processed food, that's a whole other conversation.
Right.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
this is a lot of information.
it's
This
a
is
lot.
fun.
No. No.
Got a
It's
little
good.
bonus topic in there at the end.
I
Seed
know.
oils.
Well, you get a bunch of us in the room and talk about fat. I'm passionate about it because I was like, "Meh." So
Yeah.
I get it. But it's not about that time. It's well past that time. We're gonna wrap up. So but
We're not going to talk about Splenda or like aspartame now.
no,
Okay.
no. We will save that for another conversation. But for right now, I think we're good here. I don't know if there's anything extra you wanted to add before we wrap up, Brandon or Kimberly.
I
Yeah,
think you summarized it beautifully. Sorry. Go ahead, Brandon.
I'll wrap it up. So when it comes to picking a dietary pattern or just like which way you lean on what type of food, prioritize quality. And then if you are trying to like lose weight and you need to be on a diet, quote unquote, it's more important about the caloric deficit first.
Mhm.
And then it's next is like the dietary quality and then the timing. And the last thing that's really the least important is the macronutrient distribution, like how many carbs you're having of what. So if you're looking to make some small baby steps to improve your diet today, listening, focus on just one nutrient at a time. Maybe focus on fiber this week. Focus on added sugar. Start by planning one meal this week that you're going to cook really healthy with a new recipe that you saved on Instagram or something like that.
Mhm.
Pick a few healthy snacks up at the store that you haven't ever bought before and just make some small baby steps like that to improve your diet. Don't feel like you need to make this big decision. Like there's this big decision you need to make. Okay, are you going to be low carb or low fat? You got to decide now. You don't have to decide. You can
No.
just focus on some of those small baby steps too.
I love that. Yeah.
Good stuff. Yeah.
That's what I would say too. And
Mhm.
nothing we said today was at any point meant to be a direction into what you need to do with your diet. It's really just information. So,
Yeah.
take this
Absolutely.
information and do with it what you will. But um appreciate you doing all the lovely research, Brandon. This has been
I
fun. I
know. Thank you, Brandon.
got to
Yeah,
dive
you're
into one of my
welcome.
favorite topics. This is fun. Uh
Yes.
but with that being said, for those of you listening, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to comment underneath. But with that, until next time, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.